defendant can proceed with her opening statement.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I have been charged with a crime, a serious crime. And the only question here is, did I commit this crime? Conspiracy. Conspiracy is an agreement between two or more people to commit a crime. Okay, so you see, okay. There has to be an agreement. There has to be a plan. The evidence in this case will show that Charles Vallow and I got married in February 2006. It will show that it was my fourth marriage and Charles' third marriage. At that time, we each had 2 children. I had Colby, who was 9, and Tylee, who was 3. Charles had Cole, who was also 9, and Zach, who was 7. The evidence will show that our family moved from Austin, Texas to Chandler, Arizona in 2009. The evidence will show that Charles and I adopted our great-nephew, JJ, who was born in 2012. It will also show that Charles and I were married for over 13 years and were raising 5 children. The evidence will show that I was a licensed cosmetologist and worked as a hairstylist for 20 years while we lived in Austin, Texas. The evidence will show that Charles was a licensed life insurance salesman and worked as an independent contractor, selling life insurance policies and annuities, and owned his own business. The evidence will show that Charles and I purchased life insurance policies early in our marriage, and Charles had them issued to the maximum amount possible to each of us. The evidence will show that Charles was 17 years older than me, and that because of Charles' age and an issue that he had with high blood pressure, the maximum amount of life insurance that could be approved for Charles was $1 million. The maximum amount of life insurance that I could be approved for because of my age and my health was $2 million. The evidence will show that throughout our 13-year marriage that we always had life insurance policies. When a 10-year policy lapsed, Charles would shop for another company who would approve us for the maximum amount of life insurance. The evidence will show that this was Charles' job. This is what he did. I helped him in this business, and this is what he did. The evidence will show that in 2016, Charles repurchased a new $2 million life insurance policy on me, and he was the sole beneficiary. The evidence will show that Charles and I had a happy marriage for 13 years, that he was, in fact, a baseball player, and that he played high school, college ball, and AAA ball, and that he was, in fact, a left-handed pitcher, a southpaw, they call him, but he was a right-handed batter, as could be attested to by anybody who knew Charles well and his high school baseball coach, Greg Davis. The evidence will show that Tylee was, and in 2014, our family moved from Chandler, Arizona to Kauai, Hawaii. We lived there for 3.5 years and returned to Chandler in 2017. The evidence will show that Tylee was 3 years old when Charles and I got married, and that when she became a teenager, the relationship between Tylee and her stepfather, Charles, became so difficult that Tylee and Charles had to seek a therapist, a family therapist, to stop them from fighting. The evidence will show that together, Charles and Tylee met with this therapist after we moved back to the mainland in 2017. The evidence will show that in April of 2018, Tylee's biological father passed away from a heart attack. And at that time, Charles called Social Security and made an appointment at the Social Security office.
I'm going to object to hearsay.
Sustain.
It will show that we did get Social Security for Tylee for her deceased father until she was 18 years old, and she was 15 years old at the time. The evidence will show that Charles and Tylee's fighting increased greatly in January of 2019 when Charles and I temporarily separated. The evidence will show that several people witnessed these terrible arguments between Tylee and Charles that increased to physical in 2019. Charles and Tylee had major increasing arguments, two in February of 2019, one of March in 2019, which was captured on video, one in May of 2019, one in June of 2019, and then the worst of all in July 2019. The evidence will show that in March of 2019, Charles pulled JJ out of his special school and moved him to Houston, Texas, while we were temporarily separated. Tylee and I then joined Charles and JJ in Texas in April 2019 to reconcile. The evidence will show that JJ was diagnosed with severe autism when he was 3 years old while we lived in Hawaii. The evidence will show that for 2 years, JJ was attending a school in Gilbert, Arizona, a special school for children with autism. It's called Lawrence Life Academy. The evidence will show that in June of 2019, in JJ's best interest, Tylee, JJ, and I moved back to Chandler, Arizona to re-enroll JJ back in Lawrence Life Academy since he had a difficult time with the Houston, Texas schools with no services for his autism. The evidence will show that Charles and I agreed it was in JJ's best interest to be in school where more services were available to him, so Charles and I rented a house here in Chandler. On the day in question, July 11th, 2019, Charles and I were renting two houses, one in Houston, Texas, where he mainly resided, and one in Chandler, Arizona, where I resided with our two minor children, Tylee and JJ. By this time, our three older boys, Colby, Cole, and Zach, were adults and not living at home any longer. The evidence will show that during the months of June and July, that my husband, Charles Vallow, began to send me threatening text messages. These messages were seen by my sister Summer, and that worried her. The evidence will show that Charles insisted on flying into Phoenix on July 10th, as we've heard from the state. The evidence will show that I advised Charles that he could not stay with us at the Chandler house because he could not get along with Tylee, and I did not want them to get into another fight like they had 3 weeks prior. The evidence will show that it was ultimately decided between Charles and I on text messages that he would stay in a hotel because he traveled for business all the time and stayed in hotels all the time, and that I would book it for him since I worked for him and booked all of his travel. The evidence will show that Charles did, in fact, fly into Phoenix on Wednesday, July 10th, and stayed in the hotel that I booked for him. The evidence will show that Charles paid to fly my brother Adam Cox into Phoenix from Kansas on the same day, Wednesday, July 10th, 2019. The evidence will show that Charles planned to come to our Chandler home and pick up JJ and drive him to school on Thursday morning, July 11th, 2019. The evidence will also show you that Lawrence Life Academy opens its gates at 8:25 a.m. in the morning. And the evidence will show that Charles showed up at our Chandler residence around 7:30 in the rental car I booked for him on the morning of Thursday, July 11th, 2019. The evidence will show that Charles began texting with my brother, Adam Cox, before he entered our residence, and that Charles and Adam were discussing in their text communications that my other brother, Alex Cox, was at the residence. The evidence will show that on the morning of July 11th, that Tylee was asleep in her room and my brother Alex was asleep in the guest room. The evidence will show that when Charles entered the house, only JJ and I were awake and present. The evidence will show that after we put JJ in the rental car, that Charles came back into the residence to receive his phone, leaving JJ in the front seat of the rental car with the engine running. He was 7 years old. The evidence will show that Charles began to scream at me when I refused to hand him his phone. The evidence will show that Charles' screaming woke up Tylee and Alex. The evidence will show that Tylee came out of her room with a bat to protect me, her mother, from her stepfather, Charles Vallow. The evidence will show that Tylee and Charles fought over the bat, and that after a struggle over the bat, Tylee fell onto the ground. And Charles lifted up the bat to hit Tylee with the bat. The evidence will show that Alex then intervened to protect Tylee from being hit with the bat. He did not have a gun. He was not wearing a shirt. He was pulling up his jeans because he just woke up and came into the room where he heard the screaming. The evidence will show that Alex and Charles got into a physical struggle for the bat and fell onto the ground. The evidence will show that Tylee, who was on the ground, was lifted up by me and sent outside to get away from the struggle and to protect JJ, who was still in the running car, in the rental car in the driveway. The evidence will show that after this struggle on the ground between Charles and Alex, that Charles prevailed with the bat and began to come towards me with the bat as I ran away from him into the kitchen. The evidence will show that at some point while I was running away from Charles, who was chasing me with the bat, that Alex apparently retrieved his gun. The evidence will show that I ran outside to the children and that Alex shot Charles in self-defense. The evidence will show that Tylee and I had both run outside without shoes. The evidence will show that JJ was still in the front seat of the rental car with the engine running and struggling to get out of the car. Tylee was trying to keep him in. The evidence will show that Tylee and I got into the rental car with JJ and drove away. The evidence will show you that I drove the children away from the residence towards JJ's school. Did I grab a tissue?
Yes.
The evidence will show that I drove the children through the Burger King drive-thru that Charles had promised JJ. The evidence will show that we continued to drive towards JJ's school and that the gate was not yet open at JJ's school. So we drove a block west of the school to a Walgreens where I ran in to purchase flip-flops for Tylee and myself so that we could walk JJ into school on the hot pavement. The evidence will show that Tylee and I returned directly to our residence where we met with police in our driveway. The evidence will show that we were spoken to by the Chandler police officers. And the evidence will show that Tylee and I were told by the Chandler police detectives that Charles had passed away. The evidence will show that we were put into a police van and driven to the Chandler Police Department. The evidence will show that Alex was taken by police in a police car to the Chandler Police Department, and that we were all three separated into interrogation rooms and we were each interviewed. The evidence will show that next, Tylee and I were brought back together into a room at the Chandler Police Department and were introduced to a victim's advocate who was very kind to us. The evidence will show that after speaking to the victim's advocate, that Tylee, Alex, and myself were put back into the police van and driven back to our residence. We were directed by the Chandler detectives to take the rental car and return later to the residence after we picked up JJ from school. The evidence will show that we did as instructed by the Chandler detectives. Evidence will show that we drove to Alex's residence where we attended to the wound on the back of his head. The evidence will show that Alex was then contacted by the Chandler detectives to return to the residence so that Alex could walk them through the events that occurred with the detectives at the residence. The evidence will show that Alex, Tylee, and I did return to the residence as instructed. And the evidence will show that Alex entered into the residence with Detective Moffitt, but that Tylee and I were met by Detective Inkland in the front yard. The evidence will show that at the time, Detective Inkland asked Tylee and myself if we had Charles' cell phone. Tylee retrieved Charles' cell phone from the rental car and gave it to Detective Inkland at 3:11 p.m. on July 11th, 2019. And at that time, Charles' phone was placed in the custody of Chandler Police detectives. The evidence will show that Detective Inklin asked us if we knew the passcode on Charles' phone, which Tylee proceeded to give to Detective Inklin. The evidence will show that Tylee and I left the residence to pick up JJ from school, while Alex remained at the residence with the detectives. The evidence will show that by the time Tylee, JJ, and I returned to the residence, that all police, EMS, CSI, and detectives were gone from the residence and only Alex remained. The evidence will show that the next day, I contacted Chandler Police to inform them that Charles' belongings were still at the hotel. I asked the detective if I should go get them, and I was told that they would take care of it. The evidence will show that I asked the detectives, what should we do next? And they directed us that they would contact us in about 3 weeks after their supervisor passed off their reports and Alex could go to the police station and retrieve his gun. The evidence will show that the last thing I heard from Chandler Police Department until June of 2021, 2 years later, when I received a grand jury indictment from them for this alleged crime. The evidence will show that Chandler Police treated this incident as self-defense.
I'm going to object to that.
Objection sustained. The jury should disregard that last statement.
The evidence will show you that my brother, Alex Cox, passed away on December 12th, 2019, almost exactly 5 months to the day after Charles, my husband, passed away. The evidence will show that Alex passed away from a blood clot in his lung.
Objection again.
I'll sustain the objection. It's not relevant for this matter.
The evidence will show you that I am the only person being charged with this crime.
I'm going to object to the relevance of that.
Sustained.
As the state has mentioned, they are alleging that insurance money was my motive. Social Security was my motive. Spouses having insurance policies is not a crime. Collecting Social Security is not a crime. Self-defense is not a crime. A family tragedy is not a crime. It's a tragedy. Thank you.